The wind howls across Cumberland Island. Salt air mixes with the smell of old wood and wet earth. Spanish moss hangs from ancient oak trees like gray curtains swaying in the breeze. Wild horses walk slowly through tall grass, their hooves making soft sounds on ground where, long ago, rich people in beautiful clothes danced to orchestra music and drank from the finest crystal glasses in all of America. If you walk closer to the old brick walls, walls that still stand 4 stories high, even though they're burned and broken, you'll feel something strange. Not just the coldness of stone, something heavier, something that whispers of secrets and sadness. These are the ruins of Dungeness, a place that was supposed to be paradise on earth, a place that became a monument to human pride and how quickly everything we build can fall apart. Most people, when they hear the name Carnegie, think of one man, Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, the man who gave away millions to build libraries and concert halls. His name is carved on buildings all across America. But these ruins, these towering walls surrounded by jungle and silence, they don't belong to Andrew. This story is about another Carnegie, a man most people have never heard of. A man who chose to stay in the shadows while his famous brother stood in the spotlight. His name was Thomas Morrison Carnegie. Thomas was Andrew's younger brother. While Andrew was the face of their steel empire, the voice that charmed investors and newspaper reporters, Thomas was the brain, the calculator, the man who turned Andrew's wild dreams into actual money. Without Thomas, the Carnegie Steel Company might have collapsed before it even got started. But being the shadow of the richest man in the world is a heavy burden to carry. In the early 1880s, Thomas made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He was tired of Pittsburgh's gray skies and factory smoke, tired of the endless race to make more money, build bigger factories, compete with other steel barons. He didn't build another mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York to compete with the Vanderbilt family. He didn't go to Newport, Rhode Island, where all the other rich families built their summer palaces. Instead, he looked south to a wild, forgotten island off the coast of Georgia. In 1881, Thomas and his wife Lucy bought land on Cumberland Island. It was a strange choice. The island was isolated, hard to reach, full of alligators, venomous snakes, and thick jungle. There were no hotels, no fancy restaurants, no society parties, but that's exactly what Thomas wanted. He didn't need a stage to show off his wealth. He needed a fortress, a refuge, a place where the Carnegie name would mean family, not corporation. He bought the land from a Confederate general named William Davis. Even this purchase told a story. Money from the industrial North, money earned from steel mills and coal mines, was buying land from the defeated aristocratic South. Thomas had a vision. He would build a house that would stand for centuries, a house where his 9 children could grow up, raise their own children, and create a dynasty that would last forever. He named his dream home Dungeness, taking the name from an old Revolutionary War hero's house that had once stood on the same spot. But Thomas didn't want to just restore an old building. He wanted to create something magnificent, something that would eclipse anything these Georgia lands had ever seen. This seemed impossible. Thomas was a serious man, careful with every penny he spent on steel production, always thinking about costs and profits. Yet suddenly he was planning the most extravagant project of his life. The scale was enormous. Thomas hired the best architects in America. He designed not just a house, but an entire self-sufficient world. The island would have its own power station, its own farms, its own fresh water system, its own rules. This was an attempt to create a utopia, cut off from the rest of the world by ocean and strait. Thomas poured his soul into this project. The soul he carefully hid from his business partners and even from his famous brother. He dreamed of growing old here, watching the ocean, seeing his children manage this estate, free from the factory smoke of Pennsylvania, free from the corruption and chaos of the Gilded Age cities. By 1884, construction was in full swing. Brick walls were rising higher each week. Towers reached toward the sky. The dream was becoming reality. Thomas, who had just turned 40 years old, felt that he was finally creating something that belonged only to him. Not to Carnegie Steel, not to his brother Andrew, to Thomas personally, but in his race to build this eternal home, he missed something important. Something that no amount of money can buy or control: time. None of the workers, none of the architects, none of the family members watching this palace grow suspected that a clock had already started counting down. Fate was preparing a story where magnificent architecture would become just decoration for a devastating human tragedy. Nobody knew that the master of this castle had less time left than it would take for the gardens around the house to fully bloom. And nobody could predict that the very isolation Thomas desired so deeply would become a curse for everyone who came after him. To understand the true meaning of the Dungeness ruins, we need to leave the humid heat of Georgia for a moment. We need to travel back in time and across the ocean to a small, cold town in Scotland called Dunfermline. This is where our story really begins. Thomas Carnegie was not born into wealth. He was born in 1843 in a weaver's cottage. His family was poor, very poor. The Carnegies weren't aristocrats or landowners. They were refugees of the Industrial Revolution, running away from hunger and hopelessness. When hand weaving became obsolete, replaced by massive factory machines, families like the Carnegies lost everything. In 1848, when Thomas was just 5 years old, his family made a desperate decision. They sold everything they owned and bought tickets on a ship to America. They arrived in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, with nothing but their Scottish accents, calloused hands, and desperate hope. This experience, this trauma of poverty, shaped both Carnegie brothers, but in completely different ways. Andrew, the older brother, became a showman, an eternal optimist, a charming salesman who believed he could convince anyone of anything. He learned to speak beautifully, dress impressively, and shake hands with confidence. Andrew believed in the American dream with religious intensity. He thought if you worked hard enough, spoke loud enough, and dreamed big enough, you could conquer the world. But Thomas learned something different. Thomas learned to count, to calculate, to plan. He learned that survival doesn't depend on applause or charm. It depends on the ledger book, on knowing exactly how much money comes in, exactly how much goes out, and exactly how to make those numbers work in your favor. While Andrew dazzled Wall Street investors with grand visions of steel empires, Thomas sat in back rooms, studying contracts line by line, cutting unnecessary costs, securing loans, and making sure the company didn't go bankrupt. Thomas was the anchor, the brake, the reality check. Without Thomas's careful financial management, Andrew's spectacular sales pitches would probably have led to disaster a dozen times over. Thomas's philosophy was simple but harsh. Control the variables. If you don't control the resource, you're vulnerable. If you depend on someone else for coal, they can destroy you by raising prices. If you depend on someone else for transportation, they control your destiny. This cold, calculating approach, completely lacking in sentimentality, was what allowed the Carnegie brothers to build an empire. By the 1880s, the brothers were rich beyond most people's comprehension, true captains of the Gilded Age, when industrial barons made fortunes so vast they reshaped America. But even with millions of dollars in the bank, Thomas remained an outsider. In the rigid hierarchy of Victorian society, the Carnegies were still considered new money. People with dirty hands, despite their wealth. New York's old aristocratic families, the Astors and Vanderbilts, who had been rich for generations, looked down on the steel barons. This is where we find the root of the Dungeness project. Thomas didn't want to play by the rules of Manhattan's elite clubs. He didn't want to spend his life trying to impress people who would never fully accept him. He wanted to write his own rules, create his own kingdom. His purchase of land on Cumberland Island in 1881 for $35,000 was typical of Thomas's strategic mind. He didn't just buy a vacation home, he bought sovereignty. He acquired the land from the fading aristocracy of the South, effectively replacing old feudal lords with a new industrial monarchy. It was a conquest, but unlike his factories, this was personal. Thomas, a man of silence and careful calculation, looked at those wild shores and saw something nobody else could see. A chance to build a legacy that wouldn't depend on steel prices, that wouldn't rise and fall with the stock market. He saw permanence. He saw a place where the chaos of the modern world, the world he himself helped create with his factories and railroads, couldn't touch him. But, as history often shows, the man trying to control everything around him is usually the least prepared for the chaos inside his own body. No king rules alone. No empire is built on accounting reports and ledger books alone. If Thomas was the brain of the operation, the woman who entered his life became its steel backbone. Her name was Lucy Coleman, and reducing her role to mere housewife would be a serious historical mistake. Lucy was the daughter of William Coleman, a powerful coal and iron magnate. Her father's mines fueled Pennsylvania's Industrial Revolution. When Lucy married Thomas in 1866, it wasn't just a union of two hearts. It was a strategic merger of capital and influence. This marriage transformed Thomas's position in society. Through Lucy, he stopped being just a poor Scottish immigrant who got lucky. He became part of industrial aristocracy. This union of two powerful families, the Carnegies and the Colemans, found its physical expression in the project on Cumberland Island. When Thomas and Lucy first stepped onto that shore, they saw a picture full of melancholy and wild beauty. The burned remains of General Nathaniel Greene's old mansion, swallowed by subtropical forest. This was a symbol of the fallen South. The aristocracy washed away by the tide of history. Thomas and Lucy didn't want to restore the past. They decided to build a new future on its bones. This was a perfect merging of worlds. Money from the industrial North, earned on steel and factory smoke, would erect a monument on the lands of the agrarian South, where time seemed frozen. The construction of Dungeness became a logistical feat that bordered on madness. Think about the challenge. This was an isolated island, accessible only by boat. They needed to transport thousands of tons of materials. Bricks, marble, glass, rare hardwoods, all of it had to come by water. Barges loaded with construction materials traveled from Fernandina Beach, navigating dangerous currents and unpredictable weather. Thomas hired the best craftsmen in America. The architectural style was called Queen Anne, with elements of Scottish baronial severity, a tribute to their roots. But this wasn't a light, airy beach house. This was a fortress. Every brick laid was a statement. The walls began rising in 1884, and Thomas was building something that seemed impossible. A house that would combine opposites, the wild, untamed nature of the island with the latest achievements of civilization. while alligators sunned themselves in swamps just 100 yards from the construction site. Engineers were designing plumbing and electrical systems that didn't exist yet in many American cities. This was a paradox frozen in stone, an attempt to impose iron order on jungle chaos. For Thomas, this house was becoming something more than just a place to rest. It was the physical proof of his success, evidence that the quiet brother, the shadow, was capable of creating a world where he was absolute sovereign. Lucy saw something different. She saw a future for their 9 children, a safe harbor, far from the temptations and dangers of big cities. They were creating their own Eden, their own garden of paradise, but as in the biblical story, a forbidden fruit was already growing in this garden, a fruit they would taste with terrible bitterness. As the walls of Dungeness grew higher, blocking the horizon, Thomas began to feel strange. Like his own life, energy was draining into these bricks, as if the house was demanding a sacrifice for its grandeur. When the scaffolding finally came down and Dungeness stood complete in 1885, it wasn't just a building. It was a psychological portrait of Thomas Carnegie, cast in brick and terracotta. To understand the scale of Thomas's ambitions, you need to imagine walking through the grand doors of this colossus. The first thing that caught your eye wasn't gold or diamonds. It was overwhelming solidity, strength. The main tower soared 100 feet into the sky, 30 meters of pure dominance over the island's flat landscape. From the top of that tower, you could see not only the ocean, but anyone who dared approach Carnegie property. This was architecture of control. Inside, the house had 59 rooms. Each room served a specific purpose in the family's complex world. If the outside looked like a Scottish castle with turrets and steep roofs, the inside was pure Victorian obsession with order and separation. The enormous entrance hall, paneled in dark oak wood, greeted guests with the scent of beeswax and old Europe. Light fell through tall windows in a way that emphasized the massive staircase, the house's backbone. Along these stairs, servants moved like invisible shadows, trained to never interrupt the family's life. Every detail screamed Thomas's values: quality over flash, substance over style. The fireplaces, and there were 16 of them throughout the house, were large enough to burn whole tree trunks. They warmed the vast halls during humid winter evenings when ocean winds rattled the windows. The dining room was a stage for performance. Here, the main role was played not by food, but by hierarchy. At the mahogany table, 20 people could sit comfortably. The sound of silver utensils on fine china drowned out the sound of surf beyond the windows. This was where business was discussed, where family decisions were made, where the Carnegie children learned what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves. But the most interesting aspect of Dungeness wasn't in the grand halls. It was in the invisible systems that kept everything running. Thomas, true to his industrial nature, didn't trust local conditions. He built complete autonomy. The island got its own power station, at a time when many neighborhoods in New York were still lit by gas lamps. An ice factory was constructed so that in the subtropical heat of Georgia, there would always be ice clinking in glasses. Artesian wells pumped the purest water. This was a triumph of man over nature, a declaration that money and engineering could conquer any obstacle. The house was served by an army of workers. At its peak, 200 people were employed to keep Dungeness functioning. Liveried footmen stood at attention in the halls. Cooks worked in kitchens equipped with the latest technology. Groundskeepers maintained elaborate gardens where imported plants from around the world struggled to adapt to Georgia's climate. Stable hands cared for thoroughbred horses. Boat crews maintained the vessels that connected the island to the mainland. This workforce was invisible to guests, but essential to the illusion that life could be effortless when you had enough money, that paradise could be maintained through careful management and generous wages. Thomas walked these halls with quiet satisfaction. This was his achievement, not his brother's, not the company's, his. For the first time in his life, he had created something that bore his name alone. But paradise, as every ancient story teaches us, is always temporary. The year 1886 arrived with cruel swiftness. Thomas Carnegie, at just 43 years old, fell ill. The diagnosis was a nightmare, pneumonia complicated by other infections. In that era, before antibiotics, such illnesses were death sentences for even the richest men. Thomas fought, but his body, exhausted by years of stress and overwork, couldn't win. He died on October 19th, just 2 years after Dungeness was completed. 2 years. He spent more time building his dream than living in it. The irony was crushing. The man who controlled every variable, who planned for every contingency, who built a fortress to protect his family from the chaos of the world, couldn't protect himself from microscopic bacteria. This was the moment of truth, the moment that split the history of Dungeness into before and after. Thomas's death should have ended this extravagant experiment. Logic dictated a clear path. Lucy, a young widow left with 9 children in the wilderness, should sell the estate, pack up, and return to civilization. Return to Pittsburgh or New York, where there were doctors, schools, society. The island was harsh. Maintaining the house was extremely expensive. The memories were too painful. Advisors, lawyers, family members, everyone expected retreat. Everyone expected Lucy to do the sensible thing. But Lucy Carnegie didn't do the sensible thing. This is where a transformation occurred that changed the entire genre of this story. From family saga to psychological thriller, Lucy didn't weep into her handkerchief, waiting for rescue. She looked at the empire Thomas built, and she made a decision that bordered on obsession. She refused to sell Dungeness. More than that, she decided to expand it. If the viewer has been following closely, this is the moment to feel deep moral ambivalence. Was this an act of the greatest love and devotion to her husband's memory? Or was it rigid selfishness, an attempt to control her children's lives by locking them in a golden cage on an isolated island? Lucy took the reins of power with an iron grip worthy of any steel magnate. She transformed from grieving widow to matriarch, whose word was absolute law. But her main weapon wasn't architectural, it was legal. Lucy created a complex trust fund. The terms of this document were harsh and binding. The island and the house could not be sold or divided until the last of her children died. Think about this carefully. She legally tied the fates of 9 people and their future families to this piece of land in the middle of the ocean. Dungeness stopped being just a house. It became a fortress of memory, a place where time was supposed to freeze forever. Lucy hired architects to expand the mansion further, eventually bringing its total area to 37,000 square feet. She built new wings, swimming pools, elaborate gardens. It was as if she was trying to fill the void left by Thomas's death with cubic meters of concrete and marble. As if physical expansion could somehow compensate for emotional loss. But behind this grandeur hid a growing tragedy. The children, Thomas and Lucy's 9 children, were growing up as princes and princesses in their own private kingdom. They were detached from reality, wealthy, but deprived of freedom of choice. The island became their entire world. Dungeness became their magnificent prison. Here we see the paradox of Carnegie's success. Resources that should have provided freedom were used to create chains. Lucy, perhaps, believed she was protecting the family from the corruption of the outside world, but in reality, she was creating an incubator for future conflicts. With each new building constructed, with each new servant hired, the tension grew. The tension between the desire to live your own life and the duty to preserve a legacy you never chose. Thomas had wanted a refuge. Lucy built a dynastic mausoleum where the living were forced to exist by the rules of the dead. While the widow, dressed in black, walked her domains with rigid determination, invisible cracks were already forming in the foundation of this grandeur. Cracks that would eventually bring everything crashing down. The children grew. They became adults with their own dreams, their own desires. Some wanted to leave, to see the world beyond the island, but Lucy's trust made leaving complicated. The money was tied to the land was tied to the family was tied to Lucy's vision. Arguments began, quiet at first, then louder. Some of the children married and wanted to bring their spouses to live on the island. But the island wasn't big enough for multiple families with different visions. Others wanted to sell their share and start fresh somewhere else. But the trust prevented that. Lucy had built a legal cage as strong as the brick walls of Dungeness. By the turn of the century, the world was changing rapidly. The Gilded Age was ending. Progressive era reforms were challenging the power of industrial barons. Income tax, which didn't exist when Thomas was alive, was eating into Carnegie fortune. The cost of maintaining Dungeness, with its army of servants and constant repairs, was becoming unsustainable. In 1916, Lucy Carnegie's heart stopped beating. The iron fist that held the clan together finally unclenched. The matriarch was gone, and with her death, the illusion of unity collapsed immediately. The heirs, still shackled by the legal chains Lucy had created, discovered a terrible truth. Maintaining a feudal palace in the era of the Great Depression, jazz music, and new taxation was not a privilege. It was financial suicide, the illusion of eternity shattered. The house that was supposed to last for centuries was bleeding money. Repairs were endless. Hurricanes battered the island every few years, tearing off roof tiles, cracking foundations, flooding basements. Salt air corroded everything metal. Humidity rotted wood. The jungle constantly tried to reclaim its territory, roots pushing through floors, vines strangling columns. The children, now middle-aged adults, faced a brutal choice: pour their entire inheritance into maintaining a house that represented their mother's dream, not theirs, or abandon it. By 1925, the decision was made. The family left the island. The massive house where crystal once chimed and the fate of millions of dollars was discussed fell into deafening silence. 200 servants were dismissed. Horses were sold or released. Boats were moored one final time. The grand doors were locked. For 34 years, Dungeness stood as a ghost. The jungle slowly reclaimed what was always rightfully hers. Roots cracked the foundation with patient strength. Vines strangled the columns, pulling down decorative elements. In the empty ballrooms, only the salty wind wandered, whistling through broken windows. This was painful limbo. The house was too large and expensive to live in, but too historically significant and legally complicated to simply demolish. It existed in a strange state between life and death, neither fully abandoned nor truly maintained. The tension between past grandeur and present decay demanded a radical resolution, and on June 24, 1959, that resolution came in the form of fire. The night was torn apart by flames visible for miles, even from the mainland. Orange light danced against the dark sky. Smoke rose in massive columns. Fire. History whispers that it wasn't an accident. The main theory involves revenge. A local poacher, whose leg had been shot by the estate's caretaker for illegal hunting, supposedly returned for vengeance. Whether this story is true or merely island legend, nobody knows for certain, but the result was undeniable. The fire was a predator. It devoured the precious oak paneling that had been carefully installed 70 years earlier. It melted the Tiffany-stained glass windows that had cast colored light across the entrance hall. It collapsed the floors, sending furniture, paintings, and memories crashing down into heaps of ash. Everything that symbolized material wealth, everything Thomas and Lucy had spent fortunes accumulating, was destroyed in a single night. But here's the profound irony. The fire accomplished something the family never could. It freed them. The burned house ceased to be a demanding monster that sucked resources and created guilt. It was purified down to skeleton. Thomas's ambitions and Lucy's rigid control literally went up in smoke, leaving behind only the tragic beauty of bare brick walls reaching toward the sky. The fire destroyed the roof, but in doing so, it opened the house to the heavens. Private property became eternal monument. A place where money no longer held power, where the accumulated wealth of a Gilded Age fortune meant nothing against the simple, unstoppable force of flame. Today, if you visit Cumberland Island, now protected as a national seashore, you can walk among the ruins of Dungeness. And what you'll find is not a monument to wealth, but a temple of humility. Wild horses, direct descendants of the Carnegie families, elite thoroughbreds, roam freely through spaces where once only the richest Americans walked. These horses sleep in what used to be the grand ballroom. They drink from what used to be ornamental fountains. They have no concept of property lines or monetary value. To them, Dungeness is simply home. Nature, which the Carnegies tried so hard to tame with manicured lawns, geometric gardens, and imported marble, has returned. Gently but insistently, she has reclaimed her territory. Vines have become new tapestries covering the walls. Birds nest in the towers. The starry sky of Georgia has become the only ceiling over the great hall. There is something deeply moving about this transformation. The house that was built to separate the Carnegie family from nature, to create a bubble of controlled civilization in the wilderness, has become one with nature. The fortress has surrendered, and in that surrender there is strange beauty. Tourists walk through these ruins today and feel something difficult to put into words. Not sadness, exactly, not triumph over the fallen mighty, something more complex, a recognition, perhaps, of the temporary nature of all human ambition. A reminder that the things we build to last forever rarely survive even a single century. The brick walls, still standing 4 stories high in places, frame the sky like a cathedral to time itself. Sunlight pours through empty windows, creating patterns on floors covered with fallen leaves. The sound of wind through empty doorways is like breathing. The house is dead, but somehow it feels more alive than it ever did when filled with servants and schedules and social obligations. If you pause here, if you really listen, you can almost hear echoes, not of orchestra music or clinking crystal. Something deeper, the whisper of Thomas's original dream, the refuge he wanted, the peace he sought. In ruins, Dungeness has finally become what Thomas intended, a place apart from the world, a place where time moves differently. A sanctuary, but sanctuary from what? That's the question these ruins ask every visitor. Thomas was running from the chaos of industrial America, from the pressure of competition, from the weight of expectations. Lucy was trying to preserve something she feared would be lost. The children were trapped between duty and desire. Each generation saw Dungeness differently: home, prison, legacy, burden, dream, nightmare. The truth is probably that it was all of these things simultaneously. And that's what makes this story so deeply human. We all carry contradictions. We all build things we hope will last, while secretly knowing they won't. We all try to control what cannot be controlled. There is a profound lesson here for anyone living in the 21st century, anyone obsessed with success, control, and accumulation. We all build our own small versions of Dungeness. We construct careers we hope will define us. We accumulate status symbols we believe will protect us. We create digital empires we pray will outlast us. But look at these charred walls. Look at these empty windows. They don't frighten. They don't judge. They liberate. They remind us that total control is an illusion, that permanence is impossible, that the things we clutch most tightly are often the first to slip away, and that life is not what we clench in our fist, but what happens when we open our fingers and let go. Andrew Carnegie, the famous brother, left the world libraries and concert halls, institutions dedicated to knowledge and culture. His legacy is carved in marble, his name on buildings across the country. Thomas, the quiet brother, despite his desire to hide away from the world, left us something different. Something more intimate and possibly more important. He left us these ruins, a place not for the mind, but for the soul, a place for silence and contemplation, a place that teaches without speaking. Standing here among the brick and vines and wild horses, under the vast southern sky with the eternal roar of the Atlantic in your ears, you understand something fundamental. This is the true ending of any great ambition, not to conquer time, not to defeat nature, not to build something that lasts forever, but to surrender beautifully, to leave behind a trace that, even in ruin, even in decay, continues to inspire awe with its tragic beauty. The story of Dungeness is complete. The fire is long cold, the family has scattered, the fortune has been spent. The dynasty never materialized, but the walls remain, testament not to Carnegie's success, but to Carnegie dreams. And maybe that's more valuable. Success is common among the very rich, but dreams, honest dreams about refuge and family and peace, those are universal. Those belong to all of us. When you stand before these ruins, you're not looking at failure, you're looking at the physical manifestation of hope. Thomas hoped he could protect his family from a harsh world. Lucy hoped she could preserve her husband's legacy. The children hoped they could escape to build their own lives. All of these hopes were, in their own way, disappointed. But the fact that people hoped, that they tried, that they built something magnificent in pursuit of those hopes, that's what endures. The horses move slowly through the ruins, their hooves echoing off brick. A breeze moves through the empty halls. Somewhere in the distance, waves crash against the beach, where Thomas and Lucy first stepped ashore full of dreams. If this story has made you pause, that pause matters. The Carnegies were people like you, ambitious. Flawed, hopeful, scared, determined, broken. They had more money than most of us will ever see, but money couldn't save them from the fundamental human condition. The condition of wanting more than we can have, of building more than we can maintain, of loving more than we can protect. These ruins stand as a monument to that condition, and in their honesty, in their refusal to hide the truth of decay, they offer something precious. Permission to dream big and fail, permission to build something knowing it won't last, permission to love deeply even though loss is inevitable. The shadows grow longer, the light turns golden, another day ends at Dungeness. Somewhere in Pittsburgh, in archives and libraries bearing the Carnegie name, historians study documents about steel production and philanthropic giving. They write papers about Andrew Carnegie's impact on American industry and culture. That's important work. But here, on this forgotten island, among these forgotten ruins, there's a different kind of history being preserved. The history of what happens after the spotlight fades, after the fortune is spent, after the dynasty crumbles. This is the history of impermanence, and it's the most honest history of all. Thomas Morrison Carnegie died in 1886, believing he had built something eternal. Lucy Coleman Carnegie died in 1916, believing she had protected that eternity. They were both wrong. But their wrongness doesn't diminish them, it humanizes them. It connects them across more than a century to anyone who has ever tried and failed to make something last forever. The ruins of Dungeness don't tell us that ambition is foolish. They tell us that ambition is human. They don't tell us that building is pointless. They tell us that building is inevitable. We are builders by nature. We construct homes and families and businesses and dreams. We can't help it. It's what we do, but Dungeness adds one crucial detail to that understanding. What we build will not last, and that's okay. The value isn't in the lasting. The value is in the building itself. In the dream, in the attempt, in the reaching for something beyond ourselves. As night falls over Cumberland Island, the ruins of Dungeness become silhouettes against the darkening sky. The brick walls that Thomas worked so hard to raise now frame stars instead of ceilings. The rooms that Lucy filled with furniture and rules now hold only moonlight and memory. And somehow, in this emptiness, the house has finally fulfilled its purpose. It has become a refuge. Not from the chaos of the world, as Thomas intended, but from the illusion of permanence, from the lie that money can buy immortality, from the fantasy that control equals safety. The ruins whisper their final lesson to anyone willing to listen. Build your dreams, love your people, create your legacy, but hold it all lightly, because in the end, the wind will blow through your halls just as it blows through these. Nature will reclaim your gardens just as she has reclaimed these. Time will soften your sharp edges just as it has softened these walls. And that's not tragedy, that's simply truth. The story is complete, the fire is out, the family is gone. The fortune is spent, the dynasty never came, but on Cumberland Island, among ancient oaks and wild horses, something remains. Something more valuable than any Carnegie could have purchased. These ruins stand as proof that even our grandest ambitions, even our most carefully controlled plans, even our desperate attempts to create permanence, all of it eventually returns to earth and sky. And in that returning there is strange peace, the peace Thomas was always searching for, the peace Lucy tried to manufacture through control, the peace the children could never find while trapped in their gilded cage. That peace is here now, in the silence, in the ruins, in the eternal present moment where past dreams meet present reality and future possibilities. Dungeness has finally become what it was always meant to be, not a castle, not a prison, not a monument to wealth or power, but a reminder, a teacher, a mirror. Look into these empty windows, see your own reflection, see your own dreams of permanence, see your own desire to build something that lasts, and then let it go. Open your fingers, release your grip. Watch your castles crumble into ruins that future generations might wander through with wonder. Because in the end, that's all any of us leave behind. Not the perfect preservation of our vision, but the beautiful, broken remains of our trying, and that, these ruins teach us, is enough. More than enough, it's everything. The night is complete, the island sleeps, the ruins stand, the ocean continues its eternal rhythm. And somewhere in the spaces between the waves, you can almost hear them, Thomas and Lucy and all the Carnegie children who grew up here, not speaking, just breathing, finally at peace with impermanence, finally free from the burden of forever. The story is told, the lesson is learned, only eternity remains, and eternity, these ruins remind us, belongs to no one. It simply is. But before we close this chapter, before we turn away from these haunting walls and return to our own lives, there's one more layer to this story that demands our attention. A layer that most historians overlook because it's uncomfortable, because it forces us to ask questions about the invisible people who made Dungeness possible. 200 servants, that number was mentioned earlier, but let's sit with it for a moment. 200 human beings whose names are mostly lost to history. 200 people who cleaned those 59 rooms, who cooked elaborate meals in sweltering kitchens, who laundered sheets and polished silver and maintained gardens in the brutal Georgia heat. 200 people, most of them black Americans in the post-Reconstruction South, who made the Carnegie dream function while living in quarters we would consider inhumane today. The Carnegie family's wealth came from steel mills where workers labored 12-hour shifts in conditions that killed and maimed thousands. Thomas may have been the quiet brother, the careful accountant, but his fortune was built on the same foundation as Andrew's. The foundation of human labor, valued as a commodity, calculated as a cost to be minimized. When we look at these ruins through that lens, they become something different, not just a monument to failed ambition, but a memorial to all the unnamed people who served that ambition. The cooks who rose before dawn, the stable hands who shoveled manure, the laundresses whose hands were permanently scarred from harsh soaps, the boat crews who risked their lives crossing dangerous waters in all weather, the groundskeepers who battled snakes and alligators to maintain the illusion of paradise. These people had dreams too. They had families. They had ambitions. But history doesn't remember their names. It remembers Thomas and Lucy and the 9 Carnegie children. It remembers the architecture and the fortune and the dramatic fire. But the 200, their footnotes, statistics, background characters in someone else's story. This is the uncomfortable truth that Dungeness forces us to confront if we're honest. Every Gilded Age palace, every magnificent estate, every monument to individual achievement was built on the backs of people whose labor was considered less valuable than the marble imported for. The floors they cleaned, Thomas Carnegie was not a villain in the simple sense. He paid his workers, unlike some plantation owners in the Old South. By the standards of his time, he may have even been considered a decent employer. But that's exactly the point. The standards of his time accepted massive inequality as natural, as inevitable as the proper order of things. Lucy Carnegie, in her determination to preserve her husband's legacy, employed those 200 servants for decades. She provided jobs, yes, but she also created a system where human beings existed primarily to serve her vision, her grief, her stubborn refusal to let go. When the family finally abandoned Dungeness in 1925, those 200 people lost their livelihoods overnight. Their own dreams, whatever they were swept away by economic decisions made in distant offices by people who barely knew their names. The wild horses that roam Dungeness today are treated as romantic symbols. Tourists photograph them, admire their freedom, see them as living connections to the Carnegie era. But the descendants of those 200 workers, most of them still live in poverty in the same region. Many still work service jobs, tourism jobs, cleaning jobs. The wheel hasn't turned as far as we'd like to think. This doesn't erase the human story of Thomas and Lucy. Their grief was real. Their dreams were genuine. Their tragedy was true, but it exists alongside another tragedy. The tragedy of systems that allowed a few people to command the labor of hundreds, while those hundreds had no similar control over their own destinies. When we stand before the ruins of Dungeness today, we should feel that complexity. We should hold multiple truths at once. The beauty of the architecture, the sadness of failed dreams, the romance of decay, and the uncomfortable questions about who paid the real price for this magnificence. The fire of 1959 destroyed the physical structure, but it couldn't erase the patterns of inequality that built it. Those patterns persist. They've evolved, become more subtle, but they're still here. In every modern city, there are people living in magnificent apartments, while others clean those apartments for minimum wage. In every tech empire, there are billionaires making decisions that affect thousands of workers they'll never meet. The scale has changed, the setting has changed, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Does this mean we should hate Thomas and Lucy Carnegie? Judge them as simply evil? No, that would be too simple, too easy. They were products of their time, yes, but they were also human beings capable of love and fear and hope. Lucy's devotion to her husband's memory was real, even if it became obsessive. Thomas's desire to create a safe haven for his children was genuine, even if it was built on an unjust system. People are capable of being both loving and complicit, both generous and exploitative, both dreamers and oppressors. The ruins of Dungeness teach us this too, that moral complexity is the norm, not the exception, that history is rarely a simple story of good versus evil, that the same hands that built libraries also built empires on human suffering, that the same hearts that loved their children also accepted systems of profound inequality as natural. If you've stayed with this story until now, if you've traveled with us from the weaver's cottage in Scotland to the burned walls on Cumberland Island, you've done more than consume content. You've engaged with something difficult, something that doesn't offer easy answers or comfortable conclusions. That engagement matters, that willingness to sit with complexity, to resist the urge to make everything simple, that's rare. These stories take time to research. They take effort to tell honestly. Support, through whatever means feels right to you, keeps them possible. Not because of obligation, but because depth requires resources, because nuanced storytelling in an age of sound bites and hot takes is an act of resistance. But more important than support is what you do with these stories, the questions they raise, the uncomfortable mirrors they hold up. Do you see your own contradictions reflected in Thomas's ambition? Your own attempts to control the uncontrollable reflected in Lucy's trust fund? Your own complicity in unjust systems reflected in the 200 unnamed servants? Because here's the final truth these ruins whisper. We are all, in our own ways, building our own Dungeness. We're all trying to create permanence in an impermanent world. We're all participating in systems larger than ourselves, systems we benefit from even when we don't fully understand or agree with them. We're all capable of genuine love and unconscious exploitation existing side by side in our hearts. The ruins don't judge this, they simply reveal it. They stand as witnesses to the complexity of being human in any era. And their greatest gift is not answers, but better questions, not solutions, but honest reflection. As you leave Cumberland Island, as you return to your own life with its own ambitions and contradictions, carry this with you. The image of those walls reaching toward the sky, the knowledge that everything we build will eventually return to earth. The understanding that our legacies will be interpreted by people who never knew us, who will see patterns we were blind to, who will judge us by standards we can't imagine. And maybe, in carrying that knowledge, we can hold our own dreams a little more gently, pursue our ambitions with a little more awareness of their cost, love our people a little more honestly, build our empires, whatever form they take, with a little more consciousness of who makes them possible. The story of Dungeness is finished, but the questions it raises are eternal. They're the same questions every generation must answer for itself. What are we building? Who pays the price? What will remain when we're gone? And is the reaching, the building, the dreaming itself enough, even when we know it won't last? The ruins say yes, but they also say, look closer, ask harder questions. Don't turn away from complexity. Because it's only in facing the full truth of these stories, the beauty and the ugliness, the love and the exploitation, the dreams and their cost, that we can hope to build anything worth leaving behind, even if what we leave is just ruins. Even if future generations walk through our ambitions with the same wonder and sadness we feel walking through Dungeness. Even if nothing lasts, the trying still matters, the awareness matters more, and these walls, silent witnesses to human complexity, stand ready to teach anyone willing to learn. The ocean continues its rhythm, the horses graze, the stars emerge, and Dungeness, in its ruined perfection, waits for the next visitor to arrive and ask the eternal questions. What did they dream? Why did it fail? And what does their failure teach us about our own dreams? Answer those questions honestly, and you've understood more than most ever will.